They were still laughing when he pushed his chair back, and instead of reaching for the woman everyone expected, he turned toward the one no one had been watching. A glass hits the table too hard. Whiskey spills across silk. Boots scrape against wood as every man in the room shifts at once. He doesn't look at Charlotte. He doesn't look at anyone. Just her. Standing near the wall, hands still, like she already knows how this ends. Except she doesn't. And neither does anyone else in that room. Stay with me. This is where it begins. The wind came in low across Iron Mesa Ranch, dragging red dust along the fence line and pressing it against the boots of every man who stepped through the gate that night. Lanterns hung from the porch beams, their light swinging slow, catching on polished spurs and the rims of whiskey glasses. Inside the main house, laughter rolled steady, thick with drink and expectation. Everyone knew why they were there. Ethan Cole had sent word 3 weeks earlier. A supper, nothing more written. But men talked, and women listened, and by the time the wagons started arriving, the meaning had settled in clear enough. He was going to choose a wife. Charlotte Hayes stepped down from her father's carriage just after sunset, her silk dress catching the last light like something too fine for dust and cattle. Harold Hayes followed close behind, his hand resting at her elbow, as if placing her where she already belonged. Folks tipped their hats. A few women leaned closer to each other, whispering without hiding it. She smiled like she'd been practicing it all her life. Ruth Hayes came in through the back. She had flour still caught along the edge of her sleeve and a faint line of heat across her wrist from the stove. She paused just inside the kitchen door, listening to the swell of voices in the front room. Someone laughed too loud. Someone called for more whiskey. The house felt full in a way that pressed against the ribs. She wiped her hands on her apron, then folded it once and set it aside. When she stepped into the main room, no one announced her. But the space shifted anyway. Not much, just enough that a few heads turned, then a few more, until the movement spread in small ripples across the crowd. Charlotte saw her first. The smile stayed on her face, but something tightened behind it. She leaned toward the women beside her, said something low. One of them covered her mouth, another didn't bother. Ruth kept walking until she found a place near the wall. Not hidden, not forward either. Just somewhere that wasn't in the way. A man at the far table lifted his glass and looked her over like he was trying to remember a name he didn't care to learn. Victor Langford noticed next. He had a way of speaking that carried without raising his voice, the kind that made people listen because they expected to agree with him. He leaned back in his chair, one arm slung across the back, and let his gaze settle on Ruth as if she were part of the evening's entertainment. "Well now," he said, letting the room quiet around him. "Looks like we've got ourselves an unexpected guest." A few men chuckled. It caught quick. Ruth didn't answer. She stood where she was, her hands still, her chin level. Victor tipped his head, slow, studying her. "Tell me something," he went on, his tone easy, almost kind. "You think you were invited here tonight?" The laughter came easier that time. A glass knocked against the table. Someone muttered something under his breath that didn't quite carry. Charlotte lowered her eyes, but her shoulders shook once. Ruth felt the heat climb up her throat. It settled there, tight, making it hard to swallow. For a moment, the room blurred at the edges, like the lantern light had shifted too close. She could leave. The door was right there. 3 steps, maybe 4. No one would stop her, but her feet didn't move. Victor waited, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make it feel like a kindness. "No shame in it," he added. "Mistakes happen. Especially when someone hears a story they want to believe." A chair scraped somewhere behind him. Then, soft at first, a glass met wood. The sound wasn't loud, but it cut clean through the laughter. Ethan Cole didn't look up right away. He sat at the head of the table, one hand resting around his whiskey, the other flat against the wood. The room had been circling him all evening without quite touching. Now it stopped. He set the glass down with care. Not hard, just final. Only then did he lift his eyes. He didn't look at Charlotte. He didn't look at Victor. He looked straight at Ruth. For a second, nothing moved. Not the lanterns, not the men. Even the wind seemed to pull back from the walls. When he spoke, his voice stayed low, the kind of low that made people lean in instead of turning away. I didn't ask her here to watch. The words settled into the room like weight. Victor's smile didn't disappear, but it lost something at the edges. Now, Ethan, he said, a touch too quick. I don't believe anyone meant... Ethan didn't look at him. He kept his gaze on Ruth, steady, as if the rest of the room had fallen away. Near the window, someone cleared his throat and then thought better of it. Charlotte's hand tightened around her glass. The stem trembled once before going still. Ruth felt the air shift again, different this time. Not lighter. Just changed. Like the ground had moved under her feet, and no one had said how far. She drew in a slow breath. The taste of whiskey and dust sat heavy at the back of her tongue. No one laughed. No one spoke. And still, she didn't move. Across the room, Ethan's eyes didn't leave hers. Not asking. Not explaining. Just waiting. The lantern above them creaked, its chain turning a fraction in the wind. Every eye in the house followed the same line now. Toward her. Ruth felt it settle on her shoulders, not like a weight, but like something sharper. Waiting. Measuring. Ethan didn't move at first. Then he reached for the chair beside him and pulled it back across the floor. The sound was plain. Wood against wood. No hurry in it. This seat's open, he said. No one laughed. Charlotte's glass touched the table a little too hard. A thin ring of whiskey spilled over the rim and ran down the stem onto her glove. She didn't wipe it away. Her eyes stayed fixed on Ethan like she was trying to catch a mistake before it happened. Ethan, her father said, stepping forward, voice low but carrying. There's no call for this. Ethan didn't answer him. He kept his hand on the back of the chair. Waiting. Ruth looked at the space beside him. Close enough to feel the heat of the room, the smoke in the air, the quiet that had come down over everyone like a lid. She could still leave. No one would stop her now, but something in the way he stood there, steady, not asking twice, made turning away feel like something she would remember for the rest of her life. She walked. Each step sounded louder than it should have. Boot heels on the floorboards, a shift of skirts, a breath drawn somewhere behind her and not let out. When she reached the table, she didn't look at Charlotte, didn't look at Victor either. She only looked at the chair. Then she sat. Her back stayed straight, hands folded in her lap, still carrying the faint scent of flour and wood smoke. Ethan pushed the chair in a little, just enough. No more than needed. His fingers brushed the edge of the wood, not her. He took his seat after. For a moment, nothing happened. Then someone at the far end cleared his throat and reached for the bread like the evening might still be saved by routine. Plates shifted, a fork scraped. The room began again. Not the same as before, quieter, careful. Ethan poured water into a glass and set it in front of Ruth. The pitcher didn't shake. The stream stayed steady. You'll want that, he said. She nodded once. Thank you. Across the table, Victor leaned back again, but the ease had gone out of him. Well, he said, forcing a lightness that didn't quite hold, that's one way to keep a room interesting. No one picked it up. Charlotte sat very still. The silk at her shoulder caught the lantern light, but her face had gone pale beneath it. She turned to her father, said something too low to hear. He answered without looking at her, his jaw tight. Ruth lifted the glass and took a sip. The water was cool. It steadied her hands. Ethan ate like he always did. Slow. Measured. Not watching the room, not watching her. Just there, as if the choice had already been made long before anyone else knew to question it. The talk came back in pieces. Ranch prices. A broken fence out past Dry Creek. The road to Amarillo holding up after last week's rain. Voices rose and fell, but none of them settled. Every now and then someone would glance toward the head of the table, toward the space where she sat. Ruth kept her eyes on her plate. She heard Charlotte laugh once. It sounded wrong, too quick. It died as soon as it started. By the time the plates were cleared, the night had cooled outside. The wind had shifted, carrying a hint of dust and something like coming weather. Men began to stand. Chairs slid back. Hats were found. No one said goodnight to Ruth. They said it to Ethan. They said it to Charlotte. They said it to Harold Hayes. But when they passed her, they looked through her, or past her, or not at all. Victor paused at the door, tipping his hat toward Ethan. "You've made yourself a story tonight," he said. "We'll see how it reads in the morning." Ethan didn't answer. The door closed behind him. The sound of hooves followed, fading out across the yard. Charlotte was the last to leave. She stood a moment, one hand on the back of her chair, her eyes resting on Ruth like she was committing something to memory. Then she turned without a word and walked out into the dark. The house settled after that. The lanterns burned lower. The smell of smoke thinned. Ruth rose from her seat and gathered the empty glasses. Her movements were steady again. Familiar. Ethan stood as well. Not close. Just there. "You can leave if you want," he said. She paused, a glass in her hand. "And if I don't?" He picked up his hat from the table, brushed a thumb along the brim. "Then you stay. No promise in it. No explanation. Just the truth of it. Laid out plain." Ruth set the glass down. "I'll be up before sunrise," she said. "Kitchen won't run itself." He nodded once. "No, it won't." She turned toward the back of the house. The floorboards creaked under her step, softer now that the room was empty. Behind her, she heard him move to the door, open it, stand there a moment as the night air came in. She didn't look back. By morning, the dust would settle, or it wouldn't. The sky came up pale over Iron Mesa, a thin gray light stretching across the pasture before the sun found it. The wind had dropped sometime in the night, leaving the yard still, the gates quiet on their hinges. Ruth was already awake. The stove cracked low under the first pot of coffee. She moved through the kitchen the same way she always had. Measured. Quiet. The kind of work that didn't ask to be seen. A pan slid onto the iron ring. Beans warmed slow. Bread from the night before set near the heat to soften. Nothing in her hands had changed, but the house had. When the first cowboy stepped in, he paused just inside the door, hat still on. He looked at her, then at the floor, then back at the door like he might have taken the wrong one. He muttered a good morning without meeting her eyes and moved past her to the table. The second man didn't say anything at all. They ate. Quiet, no jokes, no stories from the trail, just the sound of spoons and boots shifting under chairs. No one used her name. Ruth set a plate down in front of each of them. Same as always. She didn't wait for thanks. Didn't expect it. Outside, the sun rose slow over the ridge. By mid-morning, the yard filled with the rhythm of work, Hammers against wood. A horse stamping in the side pen. The creak of leather as a saddle was pulled tight. Ruth carried a coil of wire out past the main fence line. The post near the dry wash had split again. She set the wire against it, braced her boot, and pulled. The metal bit into her palm through the cloth, but she didn't stop. Footsteps came up behind her. Not close. Just enough to be heard. Ethan stood a few yards back, one hand resting on the top rail. He didn't say anything. She tied off the wire and tested it once. It held. "You'll want a hammer," he said after a moment. "That post won't stay straight without it." She glanced back at him. "I made it hold for now." He nodded. Like that was enough. A breeze moved through the grass, lifting dust in a low line between them. He reached into his coat, took out a pair of work gloves, and set them on the rail. Not handed, just left there. "For the wire," he said. Then he turned and walked back toward the barn. Ruth looked at the gloves. New leather. Not soft yet. She wiped her hands on her skirt before picking them up. They fit. By noon, the heat had settled in. Ruth walked into town with a short list folded in her pocket. Flour, salt, lamp oil if the price wasn't too high. The road into Dry Creek bent past a stand of scrub oak, then dropped into the main street where the dust never quite left. The general store door creaked when she pushed it open. Inside, the air was cooler. The smell of burlap and dried goods hung low. Mrs. Klein stood behind the counter, weighing out sugar for a man Ruth recognized from the next ranch over. The woman's eyes flicked up. They stayed there a second too long. Ruth stepped up, set her list down. "Morning." Mrs. Klein finished with the man first, took his coin, counted it twice. Then she turned back. "We're short on flour," she said, before Ruth could speak. Ruth nodded once. "I'll take what you have." The woman didn't move right away. Her hands rested on the counter. "Might be best you try elsewhere." "There isn't elsewhere," Ruth said, not raising her voice. The silence stretched. Behind her, someone shifted. A cough. Boots against the floorboards. Mrs. Klein looked past her, then back again. "I can't have trouble in my store." Ruth folded her list and slid it back into her pocket. "I didn't bring any." She turned and walked out without another word. The sun hit harder outside. By the time she made it back to Iron Mesa, the dust had settled into her shoes, her skirt, the crease of her hands. She set the empty sack on the kitchen table and stood there a moment, listening to the house. It was quiet. Too quiet for midday. In the front room, a stack of papers sat on the desk. Not usually there. Edges uneven, a few folded. One half open like it had been read and set down too fast. Ruth didn't mean to look, but she did. Ink stamped across the top. A name she recognized. Another beneath it. A line drawn through both. Cancelled. Another sheet beside it. Same mark. She didn't touch them. Footsteps came in from the porch. Slow. Measured. Ethan walked in, took off his hat, and set it by the door. He didn't look at the desk. Didn't look at her either. "You didn't get the flour," he said. "No," Ruth answered. He nodded once like he'd expected that. He crossed the room, picked up one of the papers, folded it again, and set it back with the others. Careful, like it still mattered how they were stacked. Then he moved to the stove and poured himself a cup of coffee. It had gone cold. He drank it anyway. Ruth watched him from where she stood, not asking, not offering. After a moment, she turned back to the counter and reached for the knife. There were still beans to cut, still bread to stretch for supper. The work hadn't changed, but something else had. Outside, a horse kicked once against the rail. The sound carried through the open window, sharp, then gone. Neither of them spoke. But the quiet between them had shifted. Not empty, just shared. The quiet held through the afternoon, stretched thin between the walls like something that might tear if either of them pulled too hard. By evening, the sky had turned the color of worn copper. Heat still clung to the ground, slow to leave. The horses in the pen shifted restlessly, their hooves dull against the packed dirt. Ruth stood by the back door, wiping her hands on a cloth that had already gone stiff from use. She could hear voices from the front of the house, not the low, familiar sounds of the men who worked the land, but sharper, polished. She didn't move closer. She already knew who it would be. Charlotte Hayes stepped inside without waiting to be invited. Her dress caught the last of the light, pale and clean against the dark wood. Harold Hayes followed behind her, his boots carrying the weight of a man used to being listened to. Victor Langford came last, closing the door with a soft push, as if he owned the place. Ethan stood near the desk. He hadn't taken off his coat. "You've made your point," Harold said, not bothering with greeting. "Now you can end it." Ethan didn't answer. Charlotte looked around the room once, her eyes passing over the table, the stove, the worn boards beneath her feet. She stopped when she reached the doorway to the kitchen. Ruth stood there, half-shadowed. Charlotte held her gaze a moment longer than necessary. Then she turned back. "This has gone far enough," she said, her voice calm in a way that felt practiced. "People are talking. You know they are." Victor moved closer to the desk, setting his gloved hand down on the stack of papers Ruth had seen earlier. "Contracts don't wait on sentiment," he said lightly. "Men are already pulling out, quietly, but not for long." Ethan's hand rested on the back of a chair. Still. "You can fix this," Harold added. "Marry Charlotte. Put things right before it costs more than pride." Charlotte didn't look at him. Her eyes stayed on Ethan, waiting. For a long moment, no one spoke. Outside, a loose board knocked once against the barn wall. Ruth stepped back from the doorway. She didn't need to hear the answer. The voices carried anyway, low and steady, but without the sharp edge she'd expected. Ethan said something she couldn't catch. Victor laughed once, short and dry. Harold's voice rose, then fell again. Charlotte said nothing more. When the front door opened and closed, the house settled back into itself. Ruth waited until the sound of hooves had faded before she moved again. Night came in slow. The lantern by the back steps cast a small circle of light across the yard. Beyond it, the land stretched out dark and open, the fence lines barely visible against the horizon. Ruth stood near the side pen, one hand resting on the rail. The wood was warm from the day, cooling now under her palm. Voices drifted from the bunkhouse. Laughter, but quieter than usual. "Losing everything," one of the men said. "For what?" another answered. A pause. For her. The words didn't carry far. They didn't need to. Ruth looked down at her hands. The skin along her fingers had gone rough from the wire. The gloves Ethan had left lay folded on the rail beside her. She picked them up, turned them once, then set them back down. The wind shifted, bringing with it the smell of dry grass and distant rain. Inside, a chair moved. A step crossed the floor. She didn't turn. By the time the sky had gone fully dark, she was back in the kitchen. The table had been cleared, the plates stacked, the stove burned low. She took her apron from the hook by the door, ran her hand along the seam where it had begun to fray. Folded it once. Then again. She set it down in the center of the table. No note. No explanation. The house didn't need one. She moved through the rooms without sound. The small space she'd been given held little: a spare dress, a comb, a piece of cloth she'd carried with her longer than she could remember. She packed them into a worn sack and tied it closed. When she stepped out onto the porch, the boards creaked under her weight. The night air had cooled enough to settle against her skin. Ethan stood at the far end of the porch. He didn't turn right away. He knew she was there. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The yard stretched out between them. The gate stood open, just enough to pass through without a hand. "I won't stop you," he said. His voice carried low, even in the dark. Ruth adjusted the strap of the sack over her shoulder. "I know." He nodded once. She could hear it in the small shift of his coat. The wind moved across the yard, lifting dust in a thin line that crossed between them and disappeared. She stepped down from the porch. Each step felt steady, not rushed, not slow. At the gate she paused, not long, just enough to look out across the land one more time. Then she walked. Behind her, the porch boards creaked once more. Ethan moved to the edge and stopped there. He didn't call her name. He didn't follow. He stood with his hands resting on the rail, watching until the shape of her faded into the dark, until the dust settled back into the road and there was nothing left to see. The house behind him stayed quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't pass. A week went by that way. Mornings came early over Iron Mesa. The same sun, the same wind dragging dust along the fence posts, but the rhythm had slipped. Meals came later. Coffee burned once before anyone caught it. A gate stayed open longer than it should have until a calf wandered too close to the road. No one said her name. Ethan worked like he always had. Out before light. Back after the heat broke. He mended what needed mending. Rode the north pasture line twice in 3 days. Checked the water troughs himself instead of sending a hand. The gloves stayed on the rail by the side pen, untouched. By the 4th day, a rider came up from Red Canyon with a folded notice. Ink stamped hard across the top. Another contract pulled. The man didn't stay long enough for coffee. By the 6th, Sheriff Miles Turner stopped by. He didn't dismount at first. Just sat there, reins loose in one hand, looking over the yard like he was taking measure. "You're making things harder than they need to be," he said. Ethan stood by the fence, one boot set against the lower rail. "For who?" "For yourself," Turner answered. Then, after a beat, "For folks who do business with you." Ethan didn't move. Turner studied him a moment longer, then tipped his hat and rode off without another word. The dust settled behind him slow. On the 7th morning, Ethan saddled early. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. The road to Red Canyon cut west through low brush and dry creek beds. It took 3 hours at a steady pace, longer if the ground gave under the horse. By the time the market came into view, the sun had climbed high enough to flatten the shadows. Red Canyon was already full. Wagons lined the outer edge, horses tied in rows. Men gathered in small circles, talking cattle and price like they always did this time of year. The smell of hay and leather hung thick in the air. When Ethan rode in, the talk shifted. Not loud, not all at once, just a turn of heads. A pause where a man forgot what he'd been saying. He tied his horse near the water trough and walked in without looking around. A few men nodded. Most didn't. Near the center of the yard, a long table had been set for the ranchers' meat. Papers stacked, ink laid out, deals waiting to be signed. Victor Langford stood near it, one hand resting on the edge, speaking to a group of men who listened with the kind of attention that comes with money behind it. He saw Ethan first. A small smile pulled at the corner of his mouth, then smoothed out again before anyone else could catch it. "Cole," he said, like nothing had changed. "Wasn't sure you'd show." Ethan didn't answer. He stepped up to the table, rested his hand flat on the wood, and looked over the papers. Names he knew. Land he'd worked beside. Lines already drawn where his name used to sit. He picked one up, read it once, set it back down. "I've got something to say," he said. It wasn't loud, but it carried. The men closest to him shifted. A few stepped back. The circle widened without anyone meaning to. Victor leaned back, folding his arms. "Go on then." Ethan didn't look at him. He spoke to the table, to the papers, to the men who had signed them. "This land doesn't run on talk," he said. "It runs on work, on hands that stay when the weather turns and the price drops." No one interrupted. He went on steady. "You all know that. You've seen it. Day in, day out. Doesn't matter who gets the credit. Works the same either way." A man near the back shifted his weight. Another looked down at his boots. Ethan paused. Then he lifted his head and looked past them, toward the far end of the yard. A wagon stood there, half loaded. A driver checking the harness. A small stack of belongings tied down with rope. Ruth stood beside it. The same dress, the same still way of holding herself, one hand resting on the sideboard like she was measuring the distance between staying and leaving. She hadn't seen him yet. Or maybe she had. The wind picked up just enough to lift the edge of her scarf. Ethan stepped away from the table, boots on dirt. One step, then another. The space between them opened without anyone saying a word. By the time she turned, he was halfway there. She didn't move, didn't step forward, didn't step back. He stopped a few feet from her. Close enough now. For a moment, neither spoke. The noise of the market faded. Not gone. Just distant. Like it belonged somewhere else. Ethan took one more step. Then he lowered himself down, knee to the dirt. It wasn't clean ground. It never was in Red Canyon. Dust and mud mixed under him, dark against the worn leather of his boot. A murmur moved through the crowd. He didn't look back. "I chose you when it cost me nothing," he said. His voice stayed low, clear. "I choose you now that it costs me everything." The words hung there, no rush in them, no weight added that wasn't already there. Ruth's hand tightened on the edge of the wagon. The driver stopped what he was doing. No one laughed. No one spoke. The wind crossed between them, lifting dust that settled again just as slow. Ruth looked down at him, at the man who hadn't followed her, at the man who hadn't asked her to stay, at the man who was asking now. She reached up, untied the scarf at her neck. The cloth slipped free, caught once in the wind, then fell still in her hands. She stepped forward. Not quick, not slow, enough. Her hand came to rest on his shoulder. Warm, steady. He didn't move until she did. Then he stood. They faced each other in the open yard. No table between them. No room left to step back into. Around them, the silence held. Not the same as before. Not empty. Not waiting. Just there. Out in that open stretch of land, with dust settling around their boots and the whole town holding its breath. Nothing needed to be said anymore. No speeches. No promises dressed up to sound bigger than they were. Just a man who stayed, and a woman who didn't turn away. Now think about it for a moment. What would you do standing where she stood, after being pushed aside, talked about, made to feel like you didn't belong? Would you still have the strength to believe someone could see you differently? And if you were him, would you stand there knowing it might cost you everything, and still choose the same person again? Because sometimes love isn't loud. It doesn't come with easy roads or clean endings. Sometimes it looks like staying when it would be easier to leave. Sometimes it looks like trusting someone who never asked you to bend, only to stand beside them. Maybe that's the kind of love that lasts. If this story stayed with you, I'd like to hear what part you felt the most. And if you find yourself drawn to stories like this, the quiet kind that carry a little weight, a little truth, there are more waiting here for you. You're always welcome back.